have begun to fear I may never hold my beloved Tilda in my arms again.
The problem you create is a political one.
Yesterday, I believed I would never have done what I did today. I feel like something important has happened to me. Is this possible? I just met her, and yet I have fallen in love with Louisa Ray.
Saving me twice, Hulu.
You fall, I'll catch you.
There is a natural order to this world, and those who try to upend it do not fare well.
I believe there is another world waiting for us, Sixsmith. A better world. And I'll be waiting for you there.
All right, good morning, everybody. So if you haven't seen Cloud Atlas, it's 6 stories interwoven together throughout history and the future. And there's like these big lessons in that. And I decided to take today's inspiration for today's lecture from Cloud Atlas. And so I'm also going to tell 6 stories. And what that means is that I won't be giving you the full history of the world, which would be impossible in 50 minutes. But I'm going to try to tell you 6 stories that bring out some key lessons that maybe will inspire you to learn more about history and understand where we come from. And the lessons of the day are drawn right from Cloud Atlas. So if you've seen it, you already know these lessons. But the lessons are this. One is that our lives are not our own. That, in fact, from womb to tomb, we are bound to others. So that we're deeply connected to people both past and present. And who we are and how we think and the way we act in the world is actually deeply bound to these connections, people both past and present. So every crime and every kindness birth our future. And another piece of this is that there is no natural order. A lot of people will claim there's a natural order, but these are just ideologies, which we've talked about before, that in fact we make the world. That is today, these natural orders are actually social orders made by every crime and every kindness, all these little things that we do day to day. And so ultimately the consequences of each life will ripple throughout eternity, and that means all of our lives as well. No matter how small we think they may be, they do ripple out through time. So let's take a look at these 6 stories and think about how they frame and what they say about the history of the past 600 years. I just want to briefly point out that 600 years ago, none of the following things existed. So just to give you a sense of how different things were just 600 years ago, the state of Kansas, of course, did not exist because the United States did not exist. But even bigger than that, no nations existed. The idea of nationalism did not exist. There was just this then an emerging globalization of the world. Consumerism did not yet exist. Individualism, the way we think of it today, did not yet exist. Love marriage did not yet exist. Rights, the idea of human rights, did not yet exist. Anthropology, of course, did not exist. And even public education did not exist in the way that it does today. So none of the things that we take for granted that make us who we are today, sitting here at Kansas in a state university in which most of us have enjoyed a public education of some kind or gone through education, end up here. And of course, the bigger story here is we're trying to explain how this woman ends up, of African descent, ends up on a Caribbean island speaking French and living off of trash. This will be part of the story as well. And part of this goes back to Yali's question. So, story 1, guns, germs, and steel. The conquest of the Americas. So we're going to put dramatic music to this and do like Cloud Atlas style for the lecture. So story one is Guns, Germs, and Steel, The Conquest of the Americas. This is based off of Jared Diamond's book. And you guys have seen a lot of this already in the class, right? And I want you to put yourself in the framework of just imagining, 10,000 years ago, the first crops being planted, and then these crops starting to spread. And imagine what it was like at that time as the earth starts to cool from this mini ice age, and our ancestors are pushed toward the equator, and we no longer have adequate food supplies. We can't just find it's harder and harder to hunt. It's harder and harder to gather foods. And so we look over and find the river valleys, and we collect at the river valleys where there is still some vegetation. And in order to make a go of it, we have to start planting crops. And so the first humans to ever plant crops happen around this time because of these larger forces, this little mini ice age. And this has all kinds of effects. Once this happens in one place, it starts to spread. It actually happens in about 5 different places around the world first, and then it spreads out from those places. And everywhere it goes, it changes the world. Because suddenly, one person doesn't have to grow food for themselves. They can actually grow food for 10 or 15 others. That means people are free to do other things. They domesticate animals. They invent new ways of construction. Large monuments start to be built. We hook the plow to draft animals, and we can farm even more. Suddenly, people can farm for even more people. Larger and larger civilizations grow. By about 5,000 years ago, we have the pyramids, and it just keeps going from there. And so this is Jared Diamond's theory of inequality, which we looked at last time, right? That we have these species spreading in the east here on a wide continent. This leads to many domesticated plants and animals, a food surplus and food storage, large stratified societies, technology, guns, germs, and steel. I want to take you into America here, and this is what America looked like at this time. A lot of people think, it was just nothing, right? There's just people living in nothing but bands and tribes. But in fact, there were civilizations. This is just over in St. Louis, Cahokia. This is what it would have looked like just before Columbus arrived. And if we look around the region, we would see why. It's because they've domesticated corn. And corn allowed them to grow these very large civilizations, not just in Cahokia and St. Louis, but also the Aztecs in Mexico. And then further south, among the Inca, it's the potato. And the potato allows them to grow their own sort of civilization with terraced farming going down the mountainsides, just this tremendous wealth from that. Back in Europe is in trouble because they're trying to trade with these areas over here, but the Ottoman Empire is blocking that trade. So they try to swing around the Horn of Africa and also start looking west to see if they can find another way to all these goods in India and China. And so they start heading this direction, and you can see they sort of accidentally run into the Caribbean. So here's Columbus coming into the Caribbean here. And this would actually be the Dominican Republic today, the eastern side of the same island where Haiti is. So this is the first piece of that story of why that woman is, from Africa, is living on this island. This is the island that Columbus is coming to here. And one of the most surprising things about this is not just that they come with such massive firepower and so on compared to the locals. It's also that they come with an ideology that they should sort of rule the world. This is the Pope at the time, and by 1494, he basically divided the entire world in half for Portugal, half for Spain. And that was just the mindset at the time, that the world was theirs for the taking. So even though there were these large civilizations like the Inca and the Aztec, it didn't matter to them. They just claimed those areas at that time. And they had one big advantage, and that was disease. This was like the hidden killer that Columbus and other people from Europe brought with them. It spread to the locals and ended up just devastating them. So even like simple interactions that might look peaceful ended up being deadly for the indigenous peoples. Within the next few decades, up to 95% of Native Americans would die of these diseases. So here we come to Cortez, and then on to Pizarro. And here's Pizarro coming in and just basically devastating the Inca Empire. In this first battle, the Spanish have such an advantage that they will have no lives lost in this first battle, while about 7,000 Inca will die. And that takes us to story 2. So that's the setup, right? This is the conquering of the Americas. The Europeans have tremendous power, but why? Not because they're smarter or because they are harder working. It's because of an accident of geography. They would just happen to be on the western edge, the sea-bearing edge of this vast area where lots of trade was happening, and they were the recipients of guns, germs, and steel that allowed them to conquer much of the world. Now, as soon as they conquer the world, it's not just about the conquering, it's not just about hard power, it's also about the way they create an economic system, what Wallerstein called the world system. And this is a very different kind of thing. As soon as the Europeans come in, they have 3 strategies for introducing this new world system, the global market. And the first strategy is that they would just physically force locals to grow crops. And if that didn't work, they could just tax the land, and that therefore forcing locals to raise money. So basically they're forcing people who maybe were not in a money economy to move into a money economy. And when they do this, there's all sorts of problems. Another way they could do this is they could take land and just run plantations, which we've seen as well. Now, what happens when this occurs, when they take over the land and run these big plantations growing cash crops, is there are these tremendous consequences for the locals. One is that market value starts to trump nutrition value. What that means is that locals are suddenly growing tobacco and chilies and things that, and coffee, things that you can't actually live off of. They grow it because it has higher market value, not for nutrition value. What happens when the market collapses then is that people have starvation. So they become dependent on the global trade, and as they become propertyless low-wage laborers, they become completely dependent on this market economy. And some of them are not just propertyless low-wage laborers, but of course some of them are also slaves. And so this is a sort of a history that we have to be careful of recognizing and seeing. Las Casas, who was a Jesuit missionary in the Americas at this time, this is early 1500s, Spain immediately starts enslaving the indigenous people. And Las Casas says he had gotten to know the local people and he had learned their language, and he felt like these are actually real people. These are not just animals. You shouldn't be able to enslave them. So he eventually convinces the Pope, and the Pope puts out a bull saying that we should not enslave indigenous people of the Americas. This is a scene from a movie made about this. So this is Las Casas here.
¡Levanta! ¡Levanta! ¡Deteneos! ¡Nombre de Dios! ¿Cómo os atrevéis? Es mío y puedo hacer con él lo que me plazca. ¡Cogedlo!
Tuvo a bien conceder
Here he
una
is
bula
going to the king.
en la que se decía que los indios eran súbditos de Dios, libres como vos y como yo.
Lo sé. También ahí intervino mi esposa, que en gloria esté.
Grande será su decepción desde el cielo cuando vea la mofa que se hizo de esta bula en Nueva España. Los indios siguen muriendo, exhaustos por los trabajos a los que se ven sometidos o a latigazos, en manos de los encomenderos. Pero Castilla seguirá mirando hacia otro lado mientras arriben barcos repletos de oro.
Habéis hecho tan largo viaje para ofenderme.
Solo hago referir una infamia.
So he ultimately convinces the king to not enslave the indigenous people, but that creates another problem because then Spain starts looking for other ways to run these big plantations, and that's when they go to Africa. And it creates what's called the triangular trade, where Europeans are going down to Africa, African kingdoms are actually enslaving other Africans, selling them to the Europeans for guns and other things. And these products then go to the slaves go to Americas. The products the slaves make go back to Europe, and that money from that trade goes back down to Africa and so on, and it just keeps going. And you guys know just how terrible this situation is, of course, but I just want to allow us again to envision it, because this really isn't that long ago, and it's an important part of this history. This gives you a sense of like what it's actually like on a slave ship, where each person is given about 4 square feet, which is, just almost nothing. Those who actually survive the journey are then, put into
Reverend Horrocks
slavery.
Specific how to run plantation. George and way best way he say.
Heat is unbearable. How do they take it?
Reverend Horrocks say, slaves like camel, bred for desert.
It's probably worth remembering that slavery is not just like bad work conditions. This is a situation where your whole life is owned. Your children are owned. Your children are sold away from you. You're nothing but property. And all of this is sort of justified by this idea of the natural order. That at this time, it was just thought that there are some people who are destined to be slave owners and others who are destined to be slaves. And it was somehow ingrained in biology or the cosmic order of things. And there's this great scene in Cloud Atlas, which shows what this looks like and sort of the justifications for this.
When I first encountered Haskell Moore's writing, its perspicuity struck me as though delivered through divine revelation. The learned doctor here and I have already spent many a night debating Mr. Moore's Tractus.
I'm only willing to concede that he makes a compelling case as to why we are sitting here, enjoying this divine land, while Kupaka stands there, content to serve.
Indeed, it is. Kupaka, you enjoy your life here with us, do you not?
Oh yes, Reverend sir. Kupaka very happy here.
You see, this is Moore's ladder of civilization. The reason behind this natural order.
Please just do shut up.
And so this is what the world system looks like at that time. When we talk about cheap labor and raw materials coming from the periphery and the origins of the world system, we're sometimes talking about virtually free labor, slaves, and raw materials coming from these periphery areas, the gold and sugar and spices and all the things that the Europeans are becoming more and more hungry for because of the rise of consumption. So we go to story 3 then, revolutions. So from the 1700s to the 1800s, a lot of things start to change. There's the famous 7 Years' War, which we know of as the French-Indian War, starts off in roughly 1754 to 1756 is when a lot of this stuff starts to happen. And these are mostly colonial wars. These are colonial powers fighting all over the world. It's a truly world war over the resources that they're all wanting to run their empires. Britain basically wins this 7 Years' War. They come away with the largest empire the world has ever seen. But the revolutions kept going, so a lot of the Americans who actually fought with the British in the 7 Years' War, like George Washington, were then trained up and ready for a revolution of their own in 1776. That's when the U.S. gets their independence. But there's other revolutions as well. The French Revolution creates a new type of system, much in similar spirit of the United States. And then other wars, Mexico. And then Haiti is a very important one here, because the Haitian Revolution is essentially a slave revolt. The island is full of slaves at the time, and the slaves rise up, and inspired actually by the sort of ideology that was in the United States and France, that all men are created equal, and including a French decree which freed the slaves in 1789, but was not followed by Haiti. They rose up and decided to make themselves free. And so this begins one of the, what would be like the largest slave rebellion the world had ever seen. But it didn't have necessarily great consequences for the local Haitians, because they needed to be able to trade with other countries, because they've become essentially a commodity economy. They can't just live off their own land anymore. They have too many people there. And so they have to trade, but nobody will trade with them. And they won't trade with them because everybody's racist. They don't want to empower a new black nation. And the United States, of course, think of like the southern states who would be closest to Haiti. They don't want to trade with Haiti because they're afraid they're going to empower this black nation, which maybe will then rise up and create a slave rebellion in their own states as well. So ultimately, this isolates Haiti. Now, the other piece of this, though, is when Haiti gets its freedom, the French give up on their plans of having their own sort of global economy working through Haiti and the United States. They had planned on being able to bring slaves into the Louisiana, what became the Louisiana Purchase, and when they couldn't do that, they went ahead and sold the land, and that's why today we are not speaking French here, is largely because of the Haitian Revolution. So then other revolutions occurred as well, Latin America and so on. But then there was also what you might call the Revolution of the Soul in Story 4. And this also happens at roughly the same time. And you heard sort of elements of it there. This idea that all men are created equal was part of this Revolution of the Soul. There are like these new ideas bubbling up about individualism and freedom and individual rights and so on that's starting to occur that we'll see in Story 4. And it's because of one other revolution that this starts to happen, and that's the Industrial Revolution in Britain. So quick clip showing what this looks like.
Until then, most people lived as they had done for generations, an agricultural existence, defined by the harvests and the seasons, and ruled by a small political and social elite. But as the 18th century progressed, an unprecedented explosion of new ideas and new technological inventions transformed our use of energy, creating an increasingly industrial and urbanized country.
And now we can actually map this out with the model of culture. So before the Industrial Revolution, you had a few ideas bubbling up in Europe, right? You had one church and one truth. This is before the Protestant Reformation as well, right? One church, one truth. You had hierarchy and rules, and you had feudal agriculture. So this would be, say, 1300s and 1400s. And then a lot of things started to shift after 1500. And that is, for one thing, there was no longer one church and one truth. There was the Protestant ethic. That is, the Protestant Reformation allowed anybody to read the Bible for themselves. That created the sense of individualism. This paired with capitalism and a market economy that was growing at the time. So these two things kind of fed off of each other. The capitalism and market economy strengthened this sense of individualism and this sense that all people should have their own freedom and rights and so on. And so this then created a different sort of social system as well. Instead of a clear hierarchy with clear rules, there was now differentiation and diversity throughout the social system. People doing lots of different things and moving often throughout the social system throughout a lifetime, and sometimes even on a daily basis. You might call this sort of everyday social mobility. What I mean by that is that in the morning, people might go to work and they're working for a boss, but then on the weekend, they're that same boss's spiritual leader. They're the local leader of the church. And so the boss who's above the person on the weekdays is below the person on the weekends. And this type of constant shifting around and seeing people in different contexts led to a sense of egalitarianism and a desire for human rights. People started to see each other in different ways, not just according to their role, but according to who they were as individuals. And this started to shift the way people thought about one another. Now, all of this is happening at the same time that slavery is still going on. And slavery starts to take on sort of the ugliness of slavery starts to be revealed, and the Zong Massacre is one key element of this in 1787. This is when a slave ship decided to essentially kill their cargo, the slaves, so they could get insurance money for the dead slaves rather than try to sell the slaves at market. This is a portrayal of this. It's fairly realistic, so this is presumably how it happened. And there's now like a monument on the bottom of the ocean memorializing these people who lost their lives. Now this sparked outrage throughout Britain among people who had sort of had this revolution of the soul, who were saying like, these are real humans, these are not just animals that we should treat like cargo or like property. And so this little emblem started being spread around. It says, "Am I not a man and a brother?" And the British abolitionists started their fight. Finally, there was this war which shrunk France's power and elevated Britain so that Britain was truly the ruler of the world, you might say, at that time. And that allowed them to create what they called the Slave Trade Act in 1807. And what this allowed Britain to do was that they could actually stop any ship at sea and search the ship for slaves. So whether they were true abolitionists or just wanted to have more British power, it created a consensus where they could actually enact the Slave Trade Act. 1833, they abolished slavery altogether, but of course in the United States, we still had slaves. Even though there were a lot of people fighting against it, this is a pamphlet that would go around at around that time, 1830s, 1840s, which would describe the horrificness of the slavery. But
slavery is a divine institution, say the people in the South Wales.
You'll notice here, like this becomes sort of religious in nature, but people are quoting different pieces of the Bible to defend their use of slavery or their desire to abolish
slavery is a satanic evil institution, say many in the North. If neither side has the sense that God is backing that up, it just becomes a human argument. But if both sides have a sense that God is backing that up, it becomes a sort of cosmic conflagration.
Moreover, of the children of the strangers that do sojourn among you, of them shall ye buy, and they shall be your possession. They shall be your bondmen forever.
Exodus chapter 21, verse 16.
Leviticus chapter 25, verse 45 and 46.
So eventually this, of course, ends in war, right? The Civil War begins. And there's a really critical moment in the war that actually doesn't happen on the battlefield. This is Lincoln surveying sort of some of the terror of battle. And all along he had sort of, you know, as this was happening, at first he thought this was really about preserving the Union. He wasn't really interested in abolishing slavery. He was more interested in preserving the Union. But as this went on and he saw all the death of this, he was reflecting on his own sort of religious faith, and his own son died during the war. And it was then that he had this sort of revelation that this had to be about something more than just keeping the Union. This had to be about real souls and something more about all of this. And eventually he decided it had to be about emancipation.
I can't listen to this anymore. I can't accomplish a goddamn thing of any human meaning or worth until we cure ourselves of slavery and end this pestilential war. We're stepped out upon the world's stage now, with the fate of human dignity in our hands. Blood's been spilled to afford us this moment, now, and you grousel and...
So, after the war, the slave trade is completely demolished. But then that begins another era, and this is what you might call the scramble. Because this little revolution of the soul that changed the way we think and brought us this idea of egalitarianism and human rights also brought with it the need for more and more resources. At the time, we were inventing all kinds of new things, and that created a scramble for Africa. We needed rubber for our vehicles. We needed fuel for our vehicles. We needed all kinds of resources to fuel this new global economy. And to do that, the Europeans moved into Africa, and in some ways, because the slave trade ended, a lot of the kingdoms that were very strong and had grown powerful during the slave trade dissolved, and in the chaos, the Europeans could easily move in and take over much of Africa in this scramble for resources. I'll just show you some sense of some of the things that happen here. You can see here, King Leopold of Belgium would actually end up killing about 10 million Congolese, sometimes cutting off their hands if they wouldn't reach their rubber quota for the day, and enslaving them, forcing them to work to reach these quotas. And so though slavery was presumably over, there was still this devastating life for many Africans that actually built a lot of the grandiosity of Europe that we see today. So you look at these amazing buildings in Belgium, and you have to remember that these were built on the backs of suffering. And again, there was this idea of the natural order that supported that, this white man's burden that you can see from 1899. Take up the white man's burden, send forth the best ye breed, go bind your sons to exile to serve your captives' need. And you can see here Uncle Sam sort of holding up the half-devil, half-children of the world as if that Uncle Sam was the savior of these places. All over Europe and in places in the United States as well, Africans were actually put on display at zoos, and there would be signs up that said don't throw peanuts at the Africans. Just the same way we would see a sign for animals. This is the mindset of that time. It's just astonishing to think that it wasn't that long ago. So then we come to story 6, what you might call the never-ending story. Because here we are today, and this woman is still living off of trash in Haiti, still very poor, still oppressed, you might say. And there's this story that goes like this that leads to her living on this trash in Haiti. The 1600s, the slave colony of France, that Haiti becomes the slave colony of France. By 1804, they win independence, but as I mentioned, in the 1800s, they're not recognized by the United States or other potential trade partners, so they have nobody to trade with. In 1825, France actually comes and demands compensation for their lost property. And what they mean by lost property is the lost slaves. I mean, it's astonishing to think that that could actually be the way people were thinking at the time, but that is exactly what they wanted. And that compensation amounted to $21 billion. Haiti was not able to fully pay it until 1947. And so Haiti has been in debt all this time, and with very few trade partners, by the 1900s, they had reached environmental collapse. So ultimately, they have very little social, cultural, or economic capital, and this is how you end up with this woman, clearly of African descent, speaking French, living on an island in the Caribbean, living off of trash.
Are you coming to the tree?
And of course, this racism still continued long after slavery. Black people were mocked in the media. There were the Jim Crow segregation. And this is not just in the United States, but also in South Africa and other places around the world. Oppression and division continued. So over the last century, most of the world has become decolonized. But it doesn't mean that the world system has stopped. It still have the core periphery. We still see the rich and the poor. We still see some people sort of living it up on the backs of others. And in Cloud Atlas, they suggest that this might continue on into the future. That in the future, they sort of make it extreme here, where these women are basically bred to work for the consumer, and they become almost like robotic in their service to the world of consumers. And as a sort of the most grotesque piece of this, they're actually ultimately fed themselves. So they're treated very poorly. And then at the end of the day, she says here that they're supposed to honor their consumers, and here they're actually fed themselves. So there's like a hero story about this, right, that you know of already.
Yeah, our mentor. You're supposed to tell us how to get sponsors and give us advice.
Embrace the probability of your imminent death.
So you guys know this story, right? The Hunger Games. And it's clearly based on the world system, right? There are these outposts that are the periphery, and then there's the capital, the core. And she's willing to give her life to change this. And so she does sort of die, and when she's resurrected, she sees the truth, that there is a revolution going on.
This is the revolution, and you are the Mockingjay.
She finds herself in this sort of fake world, which is much like our world, right?
For the camera in 3, 2, 1.
The sense that she has to kind of act and sort of play the game and not really say what she actually thinks.
Tell us what you really think.
But ultimately, she starts to find her own voice. She starts to do things that are truly rebellious and dangerous, starts to know who she really is. She finally figures out who she truly loves. And then she realizes that it's who she's really fighting. That she's actually fighting the game itself. So she blows up the game, sees past duality.
We have no fight, except the one the Capitol gave us.
She starts to realize that one system is just being replaced with another.
Real or not real?
So in the final scene, when she has a chance to destroy the leader of the system, President Snow, she takes aim at the game itself again. And Cloud Atlas is a little bit more complicated, but it has a really powerful message at the end as well. And I wanted to convey that to you. So this is what Cloud Atlas looks like. It's these 6 stories. And people sort of reappear in each of the 6 stories. It's as if their souls travel almost like a sense of reincarnation, going up or down and so on as it goes on. And I'll take you into the slavery one in 1849 in the South Pacific. This is where a slave actually, an escaped slave, saves the life of this guy right here.
Get away from me, Ewing, or I kill you. Mr. Ewing, got to flush you out.
So just to give you a sense of how this works, this is these 3 characters in 1849. You can see he is actually in love with this woman here, who actually later is Sonmi 451. She's one of the workers in that sort of scripted Chinese restaurant place that we looked at just a second ago. And then he becomes, he's saved by a slave here, and then he basically saves the slave in this one. And then this is the father of her here, who is purporting the natural order of things. And in this one, he is also sort of the main supporter of the natural order, meaning here the sort of ideological natural order. So I'm going to take you into near the last scene here, and this is where the lessons of the day come out. This is where the key lines of this story come out. So that, remember, lessons of the day: our lives are not our own. From womb to tomb, we are bound to others, past and present. Every crime and every kindness birth our future. That there is no natural order. We make the world, and the consequences of each life ripple throughout eternity. This will come back up again at the end of the lecture. So here we see the scene where this actually comes out.
The report said Commander Chang was killed in the assault.
So the love of her life was killed saving her life. And so he's asking her what it was like to see him die, basically.
That is correct.
Would you say that you loved him?
Yes, I do.
Do you mean you are still in love with him?
I mean that I will always be. Our lives are not our own.
From womb to tomb, we are bound to others, past and present. And by each crime and every kindness, we birth our future.
In your revelation, you spoke of the consequences of an individual's life rippling throughout eternity. Does this mean that you believe in an afterlife? In a heaven or a hell?
I believe death is only a door. When it closes, another opens. If I care to imagine heaven, I would imagine a door opening. And behind it, I would find him there, waiting for me.
I miss you so much.
So just to catch you up on what's happening here, she's basically being taken to her execution, and you can see that, 400 years ago or 200, 300 years ago, back in slave times, she was the woman that you just saw, right? They're the same character. And in this final scene, you'll see like this great representation of, even though it can seem sort of hopeless when we have like these really strong forces of power that seem to perpetuate through the eras, and so hundreds and hundreds of years we're fighting oppression, this next scene gives a sense of like why it's worth fighting nonetheless.
God damn you, sir, if you were not my daughter.
So just quick, so that's her father, and he's just burned a slave contract, essentially freeing a slave right in front of this guy who sees it as the natural order of things.
His husband.
Hello, Father.
Tilda. What is going on?
I've come to say goodbye.
Goodbye? Where are you going?
We're moving back east to work with the abolitionists.
What? That poison has rotted your brain?
Oh, if it has, I highly recommend it. I've not felt this good in years.
Tilda, I forbid you from going anywhere with this madman.
I've been afraid of you my whole life, Father. I'm going with my husband.
Adam. Listen to me. For the sake of my grandson, if not your own, there is a natural order to this world, and those who try to upend it do not fare well. This movement will never survive. If you join them, you and your entire family will be shunned. At best, you'll exist as pariah, to be spat on and beaten. At worst, lynched or crucified. And for what? For what? No matter what you do, it will never amount to anything more than a single drop in a limitless ocean.
What is an ocean but a multitude of drops?
we'll come back to that key idea throughout the rest of the semester, this idea that the ocean is nothing but a multitude of drops. But the lessons of the day then, our lives are not our own. From womb to tomb, we're bound to others, past and present. Every crime and every kindness birth our future. That there is no natural order, that we make the world, and the consequences of each life ripple throughout eternity. There's one last piece of this I want to share, and that is kind of this final answer to Yali's question. And I think the most important answer we could give him is that the reason why we have so much oppression in the world, and continuing on to today, is largely because we're ignorant of it, because we don't see it. And I want to share with you this beautiful poem these two guys did that really expresses how we fail to see one another.
Sometimes I stalk myself on Facebook. Will occasionally sift through photos rekindling memories of long-lost high school friends. Awkward family reunions and drunken college parties where I'm passed out in far too many inappropriate places. Then I come across the album holding images from the year I spent living in South Africa. A place where I fell in love with photography but struggled with the fine line between fully capturing my experience and exploiting someone else's suffering. Flash, there is a woman walking alongside a road made out of rocks and red soil that leads to the brink of the horizon. A basin of water balancing on her head as if the wind was holding it steady, and a baby strapped so tightly to her back that she confuses his heartbeat for her own. Flash, there is a child playing bare-chested along the riverbank, slingshotting pebbles so high into the air that they become swallowed by the clouds. Sun rays shining down on skin the color of a 4:30 a.m. sky. Flash, there is me, a no-face backpack on my shoulder, flip-flops dangling beneath my feet, and a camera around my neck like a worldly white man's bling. Try to encapsulate the essence of my experience in a mass of digitized pixels. Flash, I sit about 50 feet uphill from the river, put the camera to my eyes, and crops my world into a 2.5 by 3-inch existence, watch his bloated belly buoy in and out of the water like a bottle someone forgot to put the message in. And I can't help but feel that my actions parallel the past that once transpired on this very land. I am a 17th century European colonist, staring at an African child, ready to pull out and light up my cannon. I'm a 21st century American expat, staring at an African child, ready to pull out and light up my cannon. Whether colonization or globalization, it feels like history has a tendency to repeat itself. That night, before I fell asleep beneath those flashballs bursting in the sky, I sat down with him near our fire amidst an orchestra of dancing embers that looked like fireworks being born. I hand him the camera and he stares at the screen. Ask me what I'm going to do with the photo. Ask when people see his picture that will help for his family and they say I'm supposed to be objective, that I should resist the urge to become emotionally involved. But objectivity does not feed a hungry stomach. Pretending something's not there doesn't make it go away. Immortalizing his image on my Facebook page won't help him live beyond life expectancy that's 1/3 of my own. This camera has been used for everything. Exploitation, liberation, oppression, revolution. The ecstasy in the eyes of a little girl when her father holds her in his arms. The fear on the face of a soldier right before the first time he pulls the trigger. And I just hope my heart can remain as focused as this camera lens. They say a picture's worth 1,000 words, but I wonder what happens to word 1001. Maybe it stays where it's taken, amidst the pixels of a Facebook album. Caught somewhere between nostalgia and neglect. Taken from the lens of a man, simply trying not to be blinded by the power of his flash.
All right. So for your reflection of the day, so a couple different things. One is you could just reflect on, I'm sort of curious like how you see yourself as, you know, what drop in the ocean will you be? That's kind of a big question, hard to answer in 3 minutes. But and if you don't want to answer that one, I think your TAs would enjoy like a update on where you're at on Challenge 8. We'd really like some people to be successful on this one. This is where you're trying to actually connect with somebody out in the world to show how we're connected around the world. So if you could give an update on that, or maybe even sort of ask a question if you're stumped on it, that would be useful as well. So either a sort of deep reflection on, you know, what will your drop in the ocean be and how might it influence others? That would be the big one. Or if you'd rather just sort of do a more practical update on Challenge 8 and where you're standing on that right now, you could do that as well.